My son texted, "You're not in the family photos. My wife wants a fresh start." At 11:45 p.m. on a freezing Tuesday in Chicago, my phone lit up the dark cab of my pickup truck with a text message from my own son. It read, "Dad, you're not in the family photos for the flagship reopening tomorrow. Chloe wants a fresh start for the brand." By the time the sun came up the next morning, I hadn't just accepted my removal from the walls. I had silently set the wheels in motion to let them sign a $12 million corporate buyout that would completely and legally destroy their lives. Before I explain exactly how I used their own staggering arrogance to bankrupt them, you need to understand what they thought they were stealing. For 35 years, my name was synonymous with Davis Craft Roasters. I started the coffee and artisan bakery business with a single-used espresso machine and a commercial oven in a leaky brick warehouse on the south side. My late wife, Sarah, and I worked 18-hour days, coming home smelling permanently of roasted beans, yeast, and burnt sugar. When Sarah passed away from breast cancer 15 years ago, I poured every ounce of my grief into expanding the business. I built it into a local empire of 12 highly profitable locations. I did it all for David, our only son. I wanted to build a fortress of generational wealth so he would never have to wake up at 3 in the morning to unload 100-pound sacks of raw Colombian coffee beans in the freezing sleet. 5 years ago, my body finally handed me the bill for decades of physical labor. A mild heart attack in the middle of a busy holiday shift forced a brutal realization. I needed to step back. David was 29, armed with a shiny business degree, and recently married to Chloe, a woman whose ambition was only outmatched by her profound sense of entitlement. I brought my attorney, an absolute shark named Marcus, into my home office, and we restructured the business. I officially handed 90% of the operating shares of the newly formed Davis Management LLC over to David. I retained a silent 10% and a modest monthly draw, happily retiring to my cabin in Wisconsin, fully believing my legacy was safe in my son's hands. The text message completely shattered that illusion. I didn't reply to David. Instead, I turned the ignition of my truck and drove through the empty, snow-dusted streets of Chicago toward our flagship location. When I parked across the street and looked through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows, the breath caught in my throat. They had spent the last 2 months doing a highly expensive modernization remodel, completely locking me out of the process. Staring through the glass, I saw the exact fresh start Chloe had demanded. The warm, rustic brick walls that held decades of community history had been painted a sterile, clinical gray. But it was the massive mural behind the main counter that made my blood run absolutely cold. For 30 years, a large framed photograph of Sarah and me standing in front of our very first roaster hung in that exact spot. It was the soul of the company. That photograph was gone. In its place was a sleek, blown-up, highly stylized portrait of Chloe and David. Beneath it, a stenciled corporate timeline boldly declared Chloe as the innovative visionary who brought artisanal coffee to the modern era. They had completely, surgically erased me and my dead wife from the very history we had bled to create. I didn't break the window. I didn't storm inside and demand answers. I simply pulled my laptop from the back seat, connected to the store's secure Wi-Fi network from the dark parking lot, and logged into the executive administrative portal. I needed to see the corporate financials to understand why they were suddenly rewriting history. It took me less than 20 minutes of digging through the hidden digital folders to find the smoking gun. It was a preliminary term sheet from Vanguard Horizon, a massive private equity firm based out of New York. The pieces of the sinister puzzle snapped together with terrifying clarity. David and Chloe weren't just rebranding the coffee shops. They were staging the company for a massive corporate buyout. The private equity firm was offering exactly $12 million to acquire 100% of Davis Management LLC. According to the internal emails I uncovered, Chloe had aggressively pitched herself as the sole creative genius behind the brand. The buyout agreement included a lucrative 5-year executive contract for Chloe as the CEO, while my 10% minority share was being forcibly bought out for pennies on the dollar under a buried restructuring clause. They were going to take the millions, secure their own wealthy futures, and throw me away like a piece of obsolete machinery. I sat in the freezing truck, staring at the glowing screen. The profound betrayal from my own flesh and blood felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. David, the boy I had taught to ride a bike, was actively conspiring with his manipulative wife to steal my life's work and leave me with virtually nothing. They assumed I was just a tired, technologically illiterate old man who wouldn't understand the complex corporate maneuvers they were executing. They assumed I would just quietly accept my removal and fade away. They were catastrophically wrong. At 8 a.m. the next morning, I was sitting in a leather chair in Marcus's towering downtown law office. I slid my laptop across his polished mahogany desk and showed him the private equity term sheet and the photographs of the remodeled flagship store. Marcus reviewed the documents, his sharp eyes scanning the corporate legalese. He didn't offer empty sympathies. He looked at me, a dangerous, predatory smile slowly spreading across his face, and simply asked, "Do you want to stop the sale, Arthur, or do you want to let them hang themselves?" "I want them to sign the papers," I replied, my voice completely devoid of any parental warmth. "I want them to pop the champagne, and then I want you to pull the floor completely out from under them." The brilliant reality of my situation was something David and Chloe had entirely overlooked in their blind, greedy rush to become multimillionaires. When Marcus and I restructured the company 5 years ago after my heart attack, Marcus had explicitly insisted on asset protection. Davis Management LLC, the company David currently owned 90% of, the company he was actively trying to sell for $12 million, did not actually own the business. The LLC only owned the physical espresso machines, the delivery vans, the commercial leases, and the payroll liabilities. The actual soul of the company, the federally registered trademarks for the name Davis Craft Roasters, the exact proprietary roasting profiles that made our coffee famous, the confidential bakery recipes, and the specific brand logos, were legally owned by a completely independent entity, the Arthur Davis Intellectual Property Holding Trust. I was the sole trustee and sole beneficiary of that trust. Davis Management LLC merely leased the rights to use my intellectual property on a year-to-year basis, and buried deep within page 42 of that boring, highly technical licensing agreement was a standard change of control clause. It explicitly stated that any unauthorized alteration of the brand's core identity, or any attempt to sell the operating LLC without the express written consent of the IP trust, would trigger an immediate, non-negotiable termination of the licensing agreement. David knew about the trust years ago, but he was too lazy and too arrogant to ever actually read the foundational corporate charters. He and Chloe had completely failed to perform basic due diligence on their own family business. They were trying to sell a $12 million sports car without realizing they didn't actually own the engine. For the next 3 weeks, I played my part flawlessly. I stayed away from the coffee shops. I ignored the grand reopening of the flagship store. When David called me, sounding nervous, to offer a hollow apology about the family photos, claiming they were just trying to attract a younger demographic, I kept my voice perfectly even. I played the role of the defeated, passive old man. I told him I understood that the future belonged to the youth, and that I was simply enjoying my quiet retirement. I could hear the massive, sickening wave of relief in his voice. He genuinely believed he had successfully neutralized me. The date of the corporate closing arrived on a rainy Thursday. David and Chloe had flown first class to New York to sign the final binding acquisition documents at the private equity firm's glass-walled headquarters. They were entirely convinced they were hours away from liquidating my legacy into their personal bank accounts. At exactly 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, while David and Chloe were likely sitting in a plush boardroom reviewing the final wire transfer details, Marcus officially dropped the legal guillotine. He didn't call David. He sent a massive, legally binding cease and desist portfolio directly to the lead acquisition attorney at Vanguard Horizon. The documents clearly outlined that Davis Management LLC was currently in severe irremediable breach of its intellectual property licensing agreement. Marcus provided time-stamped photographic evidence of Chloe's unauthorized rebranding, which fundamentally violated the strict image and likeness clauses of the contract. He formally notified the private equity firm that as of that exact moment, the licensing agreement was permanently terminated. If Vanguard Horizon proceeded with the $12 million purchase, they would not be acquiring Davis Craft Roasters. They would be acquiring a collection of extremely expensive, heavily leveraged commercial leases and a warehouse full of used coffee machines. They would have absolutely no legal right to use the brand name, no access to the proprietary roasting profiles, and no rights to the recipes that actually generated the revenue. Furthermore, Marcus included a draft of the federal lawsuit we were prepared to file against Vanguard Horizon for intellectual property theft if they dared to sell a single cup of coffee under my name. The financial slaughter was instantaneous. Private equity firms do not tolerate massive, undisclosed legal liabilities. Vanguard Horizon immediately halted the closing. They didn't just walk away from the deal, they completely detonated it. I was sitting in my kitchen, sipping a cup of perfectly brewed dark roast, when my phone started violently vibrating on the granite countertop. The caller ID flashed David's name. I let it ring 4 times, letting the sheer, suffocating terror of his situation fully saturate his mind before I finally swiped the green icon to accept the call. "Dad," David screamed into the receiver, his voice cracking with high-pitched, unadulterated hysteria. "Dad, what the hell did you just do? Vanguard just walked out of the boardroom. Their lawyers are threatening to sue us for corporate fraud. They said you terminated the IP license? What is going on? You have to call Marcus and fix this right now." In the background, I could hear the distinct, shrill sound of Chloe hyperventilating. The polished, arrogant, visionary founder was having a complete mental breakdown in the middle of a Manhattan skyscraper. "I don't have to fix anything, David," I replied, my voice a smooth, chilling whisper of absolute authority. "I am simply protecting my assets. You see, when you decided to erase my history from the walls of the company I built with your mother, you fundamentally breached Section 4, Clause B of your licensing agreement. You tried to sell my life's work to a group of Wall Street suits so you could pocket the cash and leave me with nothing." "Dad, please," David begged, the realization of his catastrophic failure finally crashing down on him. "We already signed the personal guarantees for the flagship remodel. We took out a $2 million bridge loan to cover the corporate expansion before the buyout. If Vanguard doesn't wire the money today, the LLC is entirely bankrupt. We'll lose the house. We'll lose everything. Then I highly suggest you learn how to roast coffee without my proprietary profiles, son," I stated coldly. "Because as of 10 o'clock this morning, you no longer have the legal right to use the name Davis. You no longer have the recipes. And you no longer have a brand. You wanted a fresh start. You got exactly what you asked for. You can't do this to us. We're your family," he sobbed, completely abandoning any shred of dignity. "You stopped being my family the moment you took your mother's photograph off that wall," I said, my voice dropping to a freezing register. "You own a shell company drowning in renovation debt. Enjoy your fresh start." I ended the call and placed the phone face down on the counter. The silence in the kitchen was profound, heavy, and incredibly peaceful. I didn't feel a single ounce of regret. They had attempted to execute a ruthless corporate takeover against their own father, relying entirely on my perceived weakness. Instead, they had walked blindly into an airtight legal vault and handed me the padlock. The next day, Davis Management LLC officially defaulted on its massive bridge loans. The banks moved in with terrifying speed, seizing the physical assets and locking the doors of all 12 locations. David and Chloe were left drowning in a sea of personal liability, their pristine, wealthy lifestyle completely obliterated in a matter of hours. As for me, I retained total, unencumbered ownership of my intellectual property. 2 months later, I partnered with my loyal, longtime head roaster. We leased a small, humble brick building on the south side, hung the original photograph of Sarah and me behind the counter, and quietly opened a brand new shop. We didn't need a massive corporate buyout. We just needed to brew good coffee.